Our next session is the Super Election Year, Combating Disinformation to Defend Democracy. Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Good morning. When it comes to elections, we all know how busy 2024 has been. Countries representing nearly half of the world's population have held or will hold elections with more voters at polling stations than ever before. It's also been busy in other not very nice ways. Disinformation on social platforms, tech layoffs hitting trust and safety teams, and of course, the rise of artificial intelligence, all coming together to create a perfect storm, threatening the integrity of elections and the very bedrock of democracy, well-informed societies. On social platforms, which are the delivery devices for a lot of disinformation, too often algorithms are geared to maximize engagement rather than distribute reliable information. Powerful actors amplify false narratives, turbocharge influence campaigns, and sow confusion over the legitimacy of election results. And AI-generated deepfakes are already being used, as many of us know, for instance, to try and suppress voter turnout in countries ranging from the United States to Pakistan. And with so much at stake, how can platforms respond to and effectively combat disinformation across regions? What are the trends that we can learn from? What regulatory frameworks need to be put in place? And how can technology be used to restore public trust in electoral processes and protect democracy? As a newsroom leader, these are some of the questions that keep me up at night, and we're going to open up by putting some of these questions to our panel here. First question, Ritu, I'll go to you. You've had a super election, the biggest democracy in the world, and have we seen disinformation actually affect outcomes of the election? And what are some of the instances that stick out for you in India?
So, I've been hearing a lot of, since the morning, there's been a lot of references to AI's use for disinformation. But in the Indian elections, we didn't really need AI for disinformation because there was plenty happening without that. In fact, what AI was doing was actually bringing some entertainment. You've all seen videos of Modi dancing, and it just brought a meme fest. So the disinformation really starts with political speeches by the political leaders themselves. So if Modi is going to twist facts or misrepresent facts by saying that the former Congress government had vowed to take away all the wealth and give it to minority communities, mostly Muslims, then that is what triggers. Then all you need is that one statement. And that triggers not just disinformation, which impacts the way the voter thinks, but also actual hate crimes against minorities. Largely, the disinformation or the threats to a fair electoral process in India were the same old, same old. There's media ownership. I know there was some reference in the morning presentation to how the maximum trust is currently with business. But in India, most large legacy media is owned by 2 or 3 large corporates.
That's right.
And that is actually leading, so large legacy media is actually belting out disinformation behind the smoke screen of being news, including spewing hate. Social media continues to be, social media and algo. So as far as Gen AI is concerned, we didn't see anything that was really harmful in terms of disinformation, but maybe there is coded biases in the way distribution is happening, and filter bubbles or swing voters are being influenced. But I think one of the biggest problems continues to be messaging platforms. like WhatsApp in India, which is where most of the communication happens, and it doesn't matter whether content has been labeled on Meta, on Facebook, or on the community notes on X for whatever they're worth, because on WhatsApp there is no labeling. And but the good news is that the outcome of the Indian elections actually pushed back, and the BJP government Modi's government returned to power, but with a considerably reduced majority in the parliament.
Wow.
So at the end of the day, I think we were all so despondent, but I think clearly the wisdom of the voter and work done by political parties on the ground or by governments still make a difference.
Right. We're going to come back to that, a bit later in the discussion. I want to move to two people who are about to have a major election, the two Americans on stage. And I'll throw this to both of you, Jeff and Claire. What are you seeing in the run-up to the election that's coming up? And particularly for you, how is this different from when you were working on the 2020 election or the midterm in 2022? How far have we evolved in terms of disinformation and involvement of AI and new technologies in that? So I'll start with you, and then we'll go to you, Claire.
Yeah, I think there's a few industry trends to definitely take note of in terms of what is different between 2024 and, say, 2020. One really big one to note is the sort of tech industry downturn that has led to a lot of layoffs at a lot of companies. For the most part, this has hit teams equally across the country, across the companies. It's been sort of like a 15 to 20% reduction in employees across the board. But there have been teams that have been hit particularly hard and ones that are relevant for elections. So, for example, partnership teams whose role it was to interface with civil society organizations and interface with election organizations. Those teams have been hit pretty hard. And user research teams are another one that have been hit hard, where it's sort of, it has been their job to sort of ask, like, is our platform having, negative impacts or positive impacts on the world? Those teams have been hit pretty hard by the layoffs. And so overall capacity at the companies on the integrity front, on the election integrity front and the trust and safety front, has been hit since 2020. It is lower, right? And so
now, is it because it's election integrity or integrity teams are seen as not essential anymore? What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I think overall, like, they have still been seen as important and essential, but I think they've been trying to streamline them, and then there's also a philosophical shift of maybe, at the tech companies, following 2016, for example, at Facebook, to their credit, there was a lot of new efforts within the company spun up to try to increase the integrity of the platform, to try to reduce the effectiveness of bad actors. And so there was a moment when it felt like every different product at the company had an integrity team spun up trying to figure out, like, is the impact of this product positive? How can we make it more positive? I think one philosophical shift we've seen in the companies is there's less interest in that now, and there's less interest in asking the question, is our platform bad for society?
Right.
Overall, it's like, why, I think there's been a little bit of like, why are we asking this question? Why are we investing company resources in asking this question?
Right.
Maybe we should stop that. Another problematic trend on the election integrity front that's worth highlighting is, sort of the attack on integrity work, trust and safety work, the attack on countering disinformation work in general. And that's led to sort of governments around the world sort of attacking people who are fighting misinformation and fighting disinformation. It's also led to less cooperation between governments and platforms. So in the US specifically, we've seen that government bodies such as like the State Department and CISA have stopped their explicit cooperation and information sharing with the platforms, which means that if the government learns that there is a Russian disinformation operation, they're not going to be sharing that intel with the companies,
right.
Which definitely makes it harder to track this stuff online.
I want to jump to Claire. What are you seeing in the run-up to the election? How is it different from the previous one?
And I'll follow up with some of Jeff's meaningful points. We've seen a lot of, in the AI space, use of audio. So there's a very famous example. It was emblazoned on the screen a little bit before, where there was a robocall telling people that if they vote for Joe Biden, they'll face consequences. So a lot of use of audio, which is a lot harder to verify as fake. And also what's really fascinating and echoes a lot of what's been alluded to, there's the use of AI as a strategy for plausible deniability from those who are already misinforming. So this idea of the liar's dividend, we've seen Donald Trump say that Kamala Harris's crowd sizes were AI generated when they were not, and this idea that real imagery can be disregarded as fake as another tool in the toolbox of a public figure is something that I'm actually more worried about than the actual use of fakery and AI-generated material.
I did want to touch on that, though. Like, we've seen, for example, Twitter's chatbot, right? Like Grok giving wrong answers to questions about the US electoral process, and officials had to sign a public letter to Elon Musk before it was addressed. Yes, there's the notion that something is fake when even it isn't in order to undermine trust. How much is technology actually, like generative AI, actually doing the bad deeds here?
Sure. So first, just to also say, I agree that this isn't new. Donald Trump said the Access Hollywood tape was fake, and he didn't need AI to use that. We are seeing AI-generated content. We've seen AI-generated celebrity endorsements. So Taylor Swift, Swifties for Trump. And that is really afforded by the fact that Grok on X doesn't have any of the filtering that other image generation platforms have. So on Twitter, you're seeing this interesting confluence of the capacity to generate imagery. The model provider is kind of on the platform and collapses the time it takes to then share it. You don't have to go to DALL-E or to Midjourney or other services that may actually have guardrails. And then people can just, with the click of a button on the same distribution channel, share an image of Elton John purporting to claim that he's bedazzled in a MAGA shirt. And if you see that collapse, it's not only of the time it takes to take a picture or Photoshop it, you also have the model providers on the platforms and Google too. So we are seeing it, but it also empowers folks like Swift to then actually come out and endorse Kamala Harris. Her pretense for endorsing Kamala was, I've seen a lot of AI-generated misinformation about me, so I have to weigh into the discourse, even though I'm ostensibly not super political. So we are seeing it, and I hold two things to be true. This is an extension of an existing problem, but the personalization, this collapse of distribution and creation, as well as speed and ease, is really kind of changing the mistrust and character of our information environment.
I want to move it outside the envelope of the US and the Indian election. And in your work, particularly you guys, and as well as you with your partnership on AI work, are you seeing examples of AI-generated disinformation in democratic processes outside of these two countries? And if so, what has made you sit up and pay attention? Jeff, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So on the AI front specifically, I think we haven't seen it be sort of like a revolution in disinformation yet or in misinformation yet, but it definitely is an evolution, right? And so I think we've certainly seen anecdotes of it being used all across the world, right? And there's definitely some troubling cases, right? Like the Lithuania case, that was like earlier on in the year. And there's been some sort of, areas in Asia that continue to be sort of the experimental sort of innovation lab for a lot of the disinformation operations.
Right.
And discovering new techniques there that have gone from, I think it's already been highlighted, right, from bringing back people who are deceased to endorse candidates, candidates who are in prison, bringing them out of prison and letting them produce materials. So we've definitely seen like a lot of innovation in the content generation, right? But it's sort of been an evolution of the content generation, sort of to this point, like it makes it easier to make the content, but it's not necessarily like a complete transformation of it.
Right. Do you guys have anything to add to that? If not, then I'm going to move to my next question, which is, we've talked about AI. I want to move to the role of social media platforms in responding to disinformation and moderating content that you touched on in your answer. And Claire, you've led work with the Partnership on AI on responsible use of AI to make and share audiovisual content. Can you tell us about that and what measures are you saying that platforms should be taking or are taking?
So I'll just start with my aperture is kind of at the 10,000-foot view. So we work with over 120 institutions that range from newsrooms like the BBC and the CBC, but also OpenAI and the ACLU and other rights organizations. So about 5 years ago, we recognized that policy would eventually start regulating on this topic, and we need to create some governance prelude to that. And the idea is not to supplant regulation with voluntary commitments. We need that very much so, but can we kind of come together to create a set of values that could then be articulated in technology? Because a lot of times we start from first principles like transparency and consent, but we don't actually say to a company, how do you do that in ones and zeros or actually enact that? So we put out this set of guidance. I encourage you to take a look, syntheticmedia.partnershiponai.org, which basically gives certain parameters, starting with transparency, about how we actually govern the technology. And we very clearly delineate roles and responsibilities between those building the tools and models for generative media. To this kind of point I made, there are certain companies that are not distributing that content, but have kind of a ethical responsibility to do things kind of upstream, those creating and then those distributing. And one of the kind of clear aspects of that guidance is to actually authenticate content using something that we term indirect disclosure. You may have heard about watermarks or fingerprints or something called C2PA, which is a cryptographic metadata standard. In essence, you're baking in signals to say content came from this model on this day from this individual, and that may be able to travel through the pipeline. But what's fascinating about this is, like I said, a Twitter or a Meta, they play several roles within this kind of regulatory landscape. They are not only providing tools to create imagery, even Google on their Pixel phone is making it really easy to blur out an election polling site and maybe put a police line, do not cross. But they also have distribution channels, which can do their own things to read those signals of authenticity and then determine how they present those to users. So there's this kind of point of model development, creation, distribution, and user encounter that we want to have as much rich information about where content comes from to enable people to have context to understand what they see and hear.
And how are you finding, are the platforms responsive to your work?
Sure.
And how are you finding the uptake?
So I will say there is enormous effort we've seen in the Munich Tech Accord, and even with our effort. We have 18 institutions who are on board for that, ranging from Adobe to Bumble, even is very concerned with image authenticity outside of the democratic realm, TikTok. But they are all invested, and they all wrote long-form case studies about it, which I encourage you to read. But even there are some who notably don't use that. Twitter is not using these signals. So if it's not ubiquitous, that's going to cause a lot of challenges. There is a Linux Foundation open source effort that has hundreds of members, so there is uptake. But again, that's only one piece of the puzzle. Just because you have these signals doesn't mean that a bad actor isn't going to try and evade detection. And obviously, people trying to mislead democratic processes are going to do everything they can to strip out metadata and mislead the public with false labels and faulty labels.
Ritu, at Quint, you run a fact-checking initiative called WebCoof. Is that how I pronounce it?
WebCoof, yeah.
Yes. What is that, and how has your experience been working with platforms, social media platforms especially, in India, particularly around election time?
So WebCoof essentially is our fact-checking arm at the Quint. India is a difficult country for fair regulation to come, because if it's the government that's rolling out the regulation or the policies, then that's likely to be problematic, as has been the instance, in the build-up to these elections over the last couple of years. The government has been trying to control what happens with online content, including social media. For instance, they've tried to roll out what they call the IT guidelines, or when parts of that got stayed at the courts, then they rolled out, went around it and are now trying to roll out the broadcast bill, and there is the telecom bill. All of these bills are aimed at giving the control to the state to be able to pull down any content without giving the content creator or the publisher the right to argue or debate or, in defense of whatever the content is. So there is, there's there's a risk of absolute censorship.
So any content that they deem to be misinformation or disinformation or defamatory or whatever it is, would they communicate the concern that they have with the content?
No, no.
It's arbitrary and completely not transparent.
No, so just before the elections, there were 2 or 3 independent news YouTube channels run by independents, which were just taken down. They were not told why. And a lot of journalists, because, like I said, legacy media, which employed a lot of senior journalists, now is no place for journalism. So a lot of journalists have spun out and they're doing their own, using either YouTube or some other social media platform. But suddenly you'll find that their content, either it's taken down magically, a few critical videos suddenly vanish, and then you wonder, why, what's going on. But they also get demonetized. Now that's really important because their entire sustenance is coming from the monetization.
That's right.
But I just want to say that one of the things that has worked in India is collaborations. For instance, all the fact checkers have come together and we formed a body called the Misinformation Combat Alliance.
This is fact checkers from your organization, but also other news organizations.
Across India. and then we worked with Meta.
How receptive is Meta to this, almost like, organization, like people getting organized and telling them what is important to them? How responsive is Meta? Because Jeff's earlier point, integrity teams are seen as borderline, not really, as a nice to have or unnecessary. What's the feedback been over here?
To be fair, they're responsive up to a point, and they do provide a lot of support to fact checkers in India. But a critical issue of being able to label and fact check political or politicians' pages or handles, that's not allowed under the smoke screen of freedom of expression. I mean, then why not apply the same freedom of expression to anyone who's belting out misinformation or disinformation?
Can I just punctuate this point? There's something really interesting that often gets conflated in the AI misinfo space, which is just because something's AI or not is not actually the question we care about.
Right.
The question we care about is it factual
Right.
or not? And a lot of the platforms, understandably, want to use AI or not as a proxy for is it misinforming or not, because then they don't get into any political headwinds because we're just saying how the pixels have been manipulated and giving people more context about technology. So it's interesting, there's kind of this strategy to somewhat deal with fact-checking and factuality through an articulation of what's happening and how things were created and how they were made, which is very different in terms of receptivity to factuality from just like, was this AI or not?
Right.
And I think that's people also themselves. We just put out some research that said most people on platforms want AI content to be labeled, but a lot of them don't perceive those signals as neutral. They perceive them as implying something about the factuality of content. But even the BBC has used synthetic media to to obfuscate faces, to tell stories more truthfully. That's a pro-truth use of synthetic media. If you're telling a story about Alcoholics Anonymous, you might want to actually change the face to more truthfully tell the story. So I think the field is grappling with how and when do we use AI as this kind of politically neutral proxy for factuality, which is a lot harder and what we actually care about as a field.
Also, all this hype about AI has led to the focus on AI labeling. Whereas, as we know, there's not so much disinformation on using AI. Whereas the labeling needs to be more in terms of context, in terms of, true and false, or maybe false, or,
You guys set me up for the perfect segue to my next question, which is, have we, as in we the people, become savvier about identifying misinformation, whether AI generated or not? Or is there still a digital gap, a huge gap and significant gap in digital literacy? And I want to expand that to, I heard the word regulation being thrown around a bit earlier. Are those who are doing the regulating digitally literate enough to be doing the regulating, of something that we're just coming to terms with. I'm going to throw it out. Jeff, you want to pick it up, and then we'll move down the line.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like users becoming more savvy about misinformation, I guess one way I'll complement that or comment on that is, you know, the platforms themselves and how the platforms respond to misinformation. Is that becoming more savvy? I think definitely not, right? And, you know, sadly, before Gen AI, we had the problem of, you know, misinformation was much more likely to be spread online, to do well online, right? So in a certain sense, the design of the platforms are almost incentivizing people to post misinformation, because if you lie online, you're probably going to get more views. You're probably going to get more engagement. You're going to get more people hitting the retweet button and the reshare button. And that was true for older styles of misinformation, and sadly, that's also true for newer styles of misinformation.
So that's still the
Gen
case.
AI.
Yeah.
And so, like, that is still the case, right? And so, you know, to your point of like, there's good uses of Gen AI, there's bad uses of Gen AI, and unfortunately, we're still in this situation where the bad uses of Gen AI are probably going to get you more clicks and more views online. In terms of the savviness of the policymakers, I think we're definitely making progress, right? I think we've come a long way. I think from the internet is made of tubes, and you know, I worked at Facebook when you know, Mark Zuckerberg was asked the question of how you make money, and he's like, we sell ads, Senator. I think we've come a long way from those days, and I think policymakers have learned a lot and are leveling up a lot.
I remember watching.
I'll call out Ofcom in the UK, actually. So the Integrity Institute is part professional network of people who have worked inside of the companies. We actually have members at the Ofcom now.
Right.
Ofcom has actually been hiring a lot of like former insiders to help them get the implementation of the Online Safety Act right.
I remember watching that session with Mark Zuckerberg, and the level of questioning that was being put to him, and I thought, oh my goodness, are we safe with folks knowing so little about what they are about to regulate or what they want to regulate? And that worried me. I mean, is that also the case in India, Rita? Is there, are the policymakers in India, do they have the digital literacy necessary, or is the work being done from the polity, from the electorate of you know, pushing for the type of regulation that's needed? Where's the push coming from?
I think the problem lies in the government being the regulatory body.
Right.
There are enough well-informed technocrats or, you know, intelligent people who can advise them should they want the advice. But, you know, like the famous example of Gemini responding, saying that some experts feel that some of Prime Minister Modi's policies can be defined as fascist. The response to that was a sledgehammer response. There wasn't a technology understanding response. It was now anyone who's evolving or developing or innovating on any AI tool must first get approval by the government. So I think it has to be, the regulatory bodies have to be people who are not the people in power.
And there's an example of that in India, right, where influencers got together and fact-checked everything during the recent election. Is that true? Is that
Sorry?
In the Indian election, there was a lot of fact-checking being done by influencers, wasn't there?
Yes, so that was just, it wasn't fact-checking. So a lot of what independent journalism just really hard, it's very hard for that journalism to reach the people because it's easier for, you know, hype and misinformation to reach. So what a lot of influencers did was that they amplified, fact-checked journalism.
Right.
And we were able to reach the audiences we would otherwise have never reached.
Did that surprise you that you had friends among influencers who would do that, or was that planned, or was that completely?
It just happened. It just happened as things got more and more vicious during the elections. I think there was a pushback, and especially since there was this threat of this controlling of anything that is online. So it was almost like people were gasping for breath and, you know, pushing out what they could while they could.
I'm going to ask you two more questions, and then we're going to jump to the Q&A. Is there such a thing as being too savvy? As in, you know, and what I want to ask is there a risk that increasing awareness and knowledge of disinformation and AI-generated disinformation, can that be exploited by somebody to say, even when factually truthful things come out, to tarnish them as AI? Is there such a thing as being a public that is just so on the lookout for the fake stuff that they fail to see the real stuff? I'll start with you.
Yeah, I say there's this fine threshold between media literacy and profound skepticism that hinders your ability to accept anything as true. And a lot of the tech company initiatives underscore public literacy, public education, even solutions that provide transparency on artifacts themselves. We don't want people too skeptical of content. Or if most things are labeled, you may start assuming anything that's not labeled is actually inaccurate, which won't necessarily be the solution. So absolutely, there's this fine line. We need more reporting from the technology companies about how their different interventions are changing attitudes and behaviors and engagement with content and perceptions. And I'll just offer one anecdote that shows how some of these literacy techniques can sometimes backfire. We had done some research in the US 4 years ago when they were rolling out on Twitter, in the previous era of Twitter, a manipulated media label to convey that videos were AI generated. And we talked to one Republican in the middle of the country who said he thought that label was the media telling him, Twitter telling him the media was manipulating him, not anything about the actual videos being slowed down or edited. So one, yes, greater skepticism is good, but also greater transparency is good if it has its intended effect on the audiences who are actually interpreting content. So we have to ground all of our solutions in actual understanding of people and how they engage with information.
You want to jump in, Ritu?
You know, while she was speaking, I was just thinking that one of the best things that's possibly happening right now is that the oligarchies of big tech are finally going to be chipped at with, OpenAI, for instance, is now, Google had 90%.
But OpenAI is big tech, right?
Right, but at least there's competition.
Right.
Google had 90% of search, and now there's a shift to Perplexity or OpenAI. Maybe we need to really force the competition here, because and look for models where the currency is not user data and user behavior. Because if we can find solutions to that, then the exploitation and the need for maximizing engagement and that being currency, I think if you're able to break that somehow, I don't know, you guys are the...
What's the alternative to user behavior and eyeballs? What's the alternative?
Yeah, I'll say on the media literacy side, I think step one actually has nothing to do with the general population. I think step one has to do with the platforms and how they're designed and making sure that our platforms are designed in ways that amplify content that can pass basic media literacy checks. If you look at like the most widely viewed content on Facebook, for example, the majority of it is stolen content posted from anonymous accounts. So this is just like, the most viewed content on Facebook just immediately falls on its face if you do any sort of media literacy check on it. And so right now, like that's a huge burden to put on people right now to be like, oh, you must become media literacy experts as these platforms just, force you into this swarm of content that isn't trustworthy and doesn't pass media literacy checks. The alternative to it, of course, is, one example to look at is more quality-based ranking, which actually works in the principles of journalism, right? Of like, without worrying about the content itself and what the content is saying, how can you evaluate it to see if it's high quality or not? And a lot of that has to do with like, is it original reporting, or does it come from a source that regularly does original reporting? Does it come from a source that's very transparent about who it is and what they're trying to accomplish and what their funding is?
Can I say that that's what social media platforms say their algo does?
It definitely doesn't.
It doesn't. It definitely, but in principle, when we get into conversation with them, that's what they say it does. That's what their ranking is based on.
And who calls them out on that? Well, I mean, you just called them out here, but like, who's calling them out in real life? When they make that claim.
I think they're being called out all the time.
Right.
But I think when you have the monopoly.
Right. I'm going to move to audience questions, and then I'll ask one last question that I always ask at panels, but first the audience questions. The first one is from Marcella Canova. Fact-checking is hard, but that's the easy bit. How do you effectively communicate fact-checked information to audiences, especially when they previously shared misinformation online? without being patronizing or preachy? I'll give it to you first, because you do this every day at Quint.
So the only way to get people to engage with fact-check content is for it to A, ride on the same keywords that disinformation was riding on, for the content to be as for the want of a better word, as viral in the way it's created. It has to be as engaging and as entertaining, because and you have to be able to communicate it in 60 seconds or less, because that's what people are consuming. People are consuming everything in short form. So if you're able to get the story, because sometimes fact checkers take the dissemination of their content way too seriously, that it must, tick all the boxes, which I guess is important. But I think
So
during important events like elections, sometimes you have to at least get the basic information out there, do it in a video format, do it quickly, and
So you're saying it's not just the fact-checking, but also the packaging of the fact-checking that is... You look like you have something to say.
And this is with utmost reverence for both fact checkers and utmost disrespect for Elon Musk's Twitter. But I think Birdwatch, which now is known as X's community notes, is actually a really interesting method for fact checking and helping people understand content. Perhaps it's poignant that it's a democratic method of fact checking that may actually get us out of some of the democratic kerfuffles we're seeing ourselves in. That's not to reject the need for authority, but I think more Wikipedia-esque, bottom-up, distributed fact checking, which is almost what community notes is a really powerful model, just because of all of the distrust that we're seeing in institutional actors.
Can I say that at least in India, community notes are actually confusing people, because there's so many vested interests that are coming in and going and filling this community notes, and there are actually people getting more confused because the contrarian community notes. Also, now X is giving out the blue tick for money, right? So suddenly a lot of blue-ticked people are also giving the community notes, and they're using it, to forward their agenda, and that's so it's.
My understanding of community notes was that it was kind of a distribution in terms of the political spectrum and a really wide representative sample. So I'm curious how that's rendered. But the spirit of democratized engagement with a controlled sample, and if we look to Wikipedia as an imperfect but intriguing model, is one that I'm quite compelled by, the more I realize how much people's trust in individuals and institutions is kind of superseding any fact-checking we're observing in the real world.
I want to jump to Patricia's question here. How can regulators find the right balance when regulating Gen AI models, and are they doing a good job so far? I'll give you this if you want to answer this one.
I think one thing to look at is leaning more on transparency rather than prescriptions about exactly like how the model should be built. Or this also applies to social media too, right? It's like transparency can be good at creating the incentives to build responsibly without being overly prescriptive and sort of like mandating and constraining what can be done.
Okay, this is a fun one, and there's lots of questions, but I wanted to add on a up note here. Have you noticed a difference in how different generations recognize and/or react to AI in the context of elections? We'll take the India case and then we'll take the U.S. case. Have you noticed a difference in how different generations recognize and/or react to AI in the context of elections?
I think India just had fun with Gen AI, putting Prime Minister Modi in a hoodie and dancing, and there was just and getting film stars to do funny stuff around the elections. So I have yet to see anyone do something really solid and serious with it, younger or older.
Claire?
I don't have any data on age group differences, but I do know that there's a lot of reporting. I think it was Ofcom saying that young people are getting their news from audiovisual sources just much more readily, which is sure to have bearing on how people think about information. And also in the US, this isn't age specific, but I know that there was a study out of Elon University that said over 70% of people think that AI is going to affect the election. I think that included a wide range of age groups, and that is something we should take heed of, being that people are aware and getting ready for it, even if it doesn't.
Has Gen AI misinformation and disinformation not lived up to the hype? Because there was just so much hype at the beginning of the year.
It hasn't, and yet I am of two minds. This isn't a sexy answer, but it hasn't yet you don't need AI to mislead, and yet we could still see something different. And debating if it has or not, I think, detracts us from actually enacting solutions that help, promote truth and trust for any type of content, whether AI generated or not.
We're about to wrap up, and I want to give you guys this one. There's a lot of smart people in this room. What do you want them to walk away with? What is the silver lining you want them to walk away with? I'll give you guys 10 seconds each to answer it.
Yeah, I think a really important one is just that there actually are people inside the companies that are trying to fight the good fight and build them more responsibly. And actually, if there's one key takeaway, the most popular policy idea for professionals who have been on integrity teams and trust and safety teams is actually more transparency. We really do believe that if the entire world could see the sort of data sets and the dashboards that were used internally to track harms, that would dramatically change how the companies build themselves and arming society with the knowledge to respond to the platforms more appropriately.
That was a great answer. You took 17 seconds. Ritu, I'm gonna have to. 10 seconds, please.
So I'll use examples from the elections this year at India, which is that AI was actually used for elections very effectively by political parties. India has 22 official languages and some 780 unofficial, recorded languages. They used AI to be able to simulcast their speeches in multiple languages. They were able to use AI to do personalized phone calls with individuals so that they could discuss the local issues. They were able to do automated bots and calls to address people's issues. So I think consensual use of AI used well can actually make democracy a little more accessible.
Great job. Thank you. You took 10 seconds.
Two things. One, don't forget, as we're fixating rightfully on the distributors, the social media platforms, about all these new players who are building the technology to create content. That's my first thing. And second, at the same time, this is a deeply, deeply social, technical problem, and that should hearten us that it requires lots and lots of different expertise and understanding and backgrounds to actually create policies that better serve the world.
Thank you, and thank you for traveling all the way here to be at Trust Conference, and thank you all for listening. There's lots of questions here, and I know all three of you are going to be in the crowd today and tomorrow, so if your question didn't get asked, please buttonhole them and ask them your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.